Katerina Jaka watched the German soldiers flee. Streaming from the east, that's what she was seeing. Allied bombers flew above them. She thought they all might die, and then soon there was the silence of all the SS men. When the sun rose the next morning, it was the 1st of May, and they all sang the Internationale. They all sang the Internationale. Katerina Jaka saw red flags flapping in the breeze above the Russian tanks, and she fell upon her knees. And so many different voices in so many different tongues sang the most beautiful song that could ever have been sung. In German, Lithuanian, in Polish and in Dutch, a myriad of melodies has never had been such. In Russian and in Yiddish, Italian and French, emerging from the forests beneath the trench. When the sun rose the next morning, it was the 1st of May, and they all sang the Internationale. When the sun rose the next morning, it was the 1st of May, and they all sang the Internationale. They all sang the Internationale. Völker hört die Signale auf zum letzten Gefecht. Die Internationale erkämpft das Menschenrecht. Völker hört die Signale auf zum letzten Gefecht. Die Internationale erkämpft das Menschenrecht.
Hello and welcome to Revolutionary Socialist Review with Chris Driscoll and Rainer Shea. First up tonight, cultural hegemony, capitalist rationalization, and how ideology bonds people to imperialist propaganda. Rainer Shea.
You know, there is a dual nature to why Americans support imperialism, or why so many Americans believe the narratives which bolster imperialism. The American people, on the one hand, are exploited by capitalism, yet they also benefit from the exploitation of the global South in many respects. So they're caught between these conflicting interests. And as Che Guevara said, the imperialist countries keep their own working class placated by giving them a select amount of benefits. So I believe that selfishness does factor into why so many people in the imperial center are willing to believe the narratives which bolster imperialism. But Gramsci should also be taken into account, because Gramsci said that the cultural hegemony is able to mold people just by existing. Just because cultural hegemony of imperialism is here, the majority of people are going to accept it because it's all that they know. They don't know anything else. So those are the factors that I believe are behind why the majority of Americans have been willing to accept, say, the Ukraine war narratives, the narratives characterizing Russia's actions as a war of aggression instead of as a humanitarian intervention. And I believe that if we combat the cultural hegemony, then we're going to get most people eventually to renounce these narratives. because even though Americans benefit from imperialism technically, at the same time, they live under capitalist exploitation, and their living standards would be greatly improved if U.S. imperialism were to be abolished and if they were able to live under socialism. The only reason why most Americans aren't embracing an alternative to imperialism is because they've been conditioned to believe that there is no alternative. They're being conditioned to believe that the only way for them to have any hope of continued comfort is through a continuation of imperialism. Like this is their only option, but it's not their only option. And it's the duty of communists to show them that there is an alternative.
Well, well said, well put. A few thoughts on my side. I do believe that Che Guevara was correct when he said it in the early 60s and the 1950s. That was the case back then. Capitalism was in a position then to buy off the working class to a great extent. All of that changed at the end of 1991. All of that changed after 1991, with the fall of the Soviet Union, with the total collapse of the Soviet Union. That all changed. And the position of the working class in the United States especially deteriorated quickly after that. And after 2008, it deteriorated drastically. So that today we find a working class in the United States that in many ways is on par, on a level with third world working classes. They live in dilapidated conditions to a great extent. We have seen our standard of living deteriorate. So what Che said then was correct, but today it is no longer true.
Yes.
Gramsci, on the other hand, what Gramsci said is still utterly and totally true. The capitalist cultural hegemony is still tremendously powerful. And what deteriorates it is the deterioration of the living standard of the working class. So we'll have to wait and see what happens. I don't think that it stands up forever to the deterioration of the standard of living of the working class and the shabby way that the working class has been treated. Since the end of the Soviet Union, the capitalist class in America could give a fuck about buying off the working class. They don't do it anymore, and they want the working class to come to expect nothing from them, nothing but the same level of oppression that they've been dishing out for decades now.
Yeah, another point is something I quoted from the article, this article from a few years ago by columnist Edward Curtin, who assessed that throughout the last generation or so, the imperialist cultural hegemony has actually tightened its grip over the popular consciousness. It feels like there has been an increase in these kinds of pro-war narratives that come along with the advent of the new Cold War, or rather the intensification of the Cold War that never really ended, and the legalization of covert domestic propaganda since 2013. Our society has been so awash in sneaky narratives that vilify Washington's rival countries, and it's all disguised as actual organic journalism, actual organic academia, at the same time that the military has been increasing its partnership with academia to innovate in cognitive warfare.
Yes, all true. And very much so in the current period. We've seen an intensification of the and a sophistication, an increased sophistication of the cultural hegemony, at the same time that we've seen a tightening up of security measures against the working class in this country. Things have deteriorated. Okay, next on the agenda tonight, China refutes Blinken's slander. In response to the latest remarks by U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, who sees China posing great challenges to the so-called rule-based international order, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson refuted those claims and urged the U.S. to reflect on what international order people want, rather than a U.S.-led hegemony and groundless containment of other countries' legitimate rights. When Blinken claimed that the U.S. sought to build an order very imperfectly but profoundly liberal in nature, does it mean it's the order based on which the U.S. can do whatever it wants and other countries can only follow its steps? Joe Lijian, spokesperson from the Chinese ministry, asked during a press conference on Thursday, does it mean that the U.S. can attack other sovereign countries militarily at will, while other countries can only keep quiet and endure it? Does it mean that the U.S. can arbitrarily and unilaterally slap illegal sanctions on other sovereign countries while other countries have to accept it? Does it mean that the U.S. can attack, smear, suppress, and contain other countries' legitimate sovereignty, security, and development rights without a bottom line, while other countries can only wait and never fight back? Joe asked. Blinken said at the Foreign Affairs magazine Centennial celebration on Wednesday that China posed the most serious long-term challenge to that rules-based order. The order that we've sought to build very imperfectly, but that we've sought to build, is profoundly liberal in nature, the U.S. official said, claiming that the order that China seeks is illiberal, and the U.S. disagrees. This is not so-called freedom nor order. It's hegemony and bullying, Joe said, noting that the U.S., along with a few countries, came up with the so-called rules which are rejected by people from other countries who want equal shared common security, common development, and prosperity. It's time for the U.S. to reflect and truly assume the responsibilities for the world's peace and development, the Chinese official said.
Yeah, these are the kinds of hypocrisies that are so easy to point out in response to Washington's rhetoric on Ukraine. And the fundamental difference between what Russia is doing with its military intervention and with what the United States does with its military interventions is Russia actually upholds the responsibility to protect doctrine that the United States claims to uphold. And Putin had to be heavily pushed into doing this by the more left-wing aspects of his country's political elements. Putin is a right-wing opportunist who will do whatever is politically beneficial for him, whereas the Russian Communist Party always takes the stance that is best for combating global fascism and imperialism. And the Russian Communist Party wanted him to do this years ago, but he was dragging his feet until he decided it was beneficial for him.
Yes.
So this is not the behavior of a leader that has been feverishly waiting to strike and carry out a new global Russian colonialist project. It's the behavior of somebody who is looking out for himself and is getting pushed into doing things that have net positive impacts.
Yes, well put, and very true. Putin took 8 long years while Russian-speaking and ethnic Russian people in the Donetsk, the Donbass region and Donetsk and really the whole eastern and southern part of Ukraine were being slaughtered by their thousands by the Nazis. Putin just sat on his fat ass and did nothing. So yes, you are correct. Putin dragged his feet until he was forced by the Russian people to do this. Okay, next, U.S. blunders in Ukraine. This comes from a sit rep on the Vineyard of the Sacker website on what's going on in Ukraine. There's a couple of items. This is much longer sit rep, but and we'll have the link for anyone who wants to look at it. But these are a couple of items that I particularly thought were important. Moscow warns Biden's Ukraine missile backtrack risks direct confrontation. Just 24 hours after insisting he wouldn't supply Kiev with long-range missile systems, Joe Biden has flip-flopped and now pledged more advanced anti-tank, anti-aircraft, and precision systems after being pressured by officials, including Obama's ambassador to Russia. Biden claimed the U.S. is not encouraging or enabling Ukraine to strike beyond its borders and didn't want to prolong the war or enter conflict against Russia. But his move was viewed extremely negatively by Moscow. And also, Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Rybkov told RAI Novosti Wednesday that the supply of missiles and further weaponry would increase risk of direct confrontation. And China conducts necessary military drills near Taiwan after U.S. collusion. China military commanders have confirmed recent seaborne and airborne military drills near Taiwan as a necessary action following what they called collusion between the U.S. and Taipei. Last week, President Biden reiterated America's intention to back Taiwan in the event of an invasion, while Senator Tammy Duckworth arrived for a surprise 3-day visit on Monday. PLA commander Xi Yi insisted Washington's support will push Taiwan into a dangerous situation, and the U.S. itself will face serious consequences.
On the Ukraine thing, I feel like what Washington is trying to do is prop up a country's military that was blasted basically out of existence a long time ago at this point, and act like it can keep holding its own, even though it has to pretty much totally rely on extremely heavy U.S. aid. It's basically just Washington's war at this point. Ukraine is just the weak, blown apart vessel that Washington is using to wage this proxy war. And at what point is Washington going to decide to call it quits? Because the Biden administration's goal is to weaken Russia, but at this rate, Washington is weakening itself by wasting its resources, and more importantly, wasting the good faith of its own people, because this war is messing up gas prices, messing up the prices for essential goods like baby formula, increasing inflation. It's having all of these dire costs for the social stability of U.S. capitalism. And I wonder what the situation is going to look like by the end of this year.
Good question, because there's a lot to come. There's some really big secret bombs that come along with this that are going to explode over the entire world. Anyway, the next point: what fascist Ukraine's imminent defeat means for the Zionist ideology it's tied into. Rainer Shea.
There are some parallels between the ideology of Ukraine's ultranationalist regime and the ideology of Zionism. Both of them essentially want to replicate America's manifest destiny by seizing land from what they see as the undeserving native populations and give that land to what they see as the deserving populations, even though really there's not too much of an ethnic difference between Russians and Ukrainians. They want to seize the land from the Donbass peoples, clear out that territory through ethnic cleansing, and give the land to these psycho neo-Nazis that they've been backing on the Donbass front. And both of these ideologies are going to be dealt blows when Ukraine is shown undeniably to be losing. When Ukraine loses, Zionism is going to suffer a loss as well, because both Zionism and rely on conviction that their victory is inevitable, that history is on their side. If the Ukrainians can't defeat the ethnic Russians that they're fighting to achieve a modern Lebensraum manifest destiny in that eastern part of the country, then Zionism is going to implicitly be repudiated as well, because the tide is shown to be turning historically against colonialist ideologies in general. And ultimately, that's going to carry through into the imperial center, the United States, where the colonial contradiction is at play in tandem with the class contradiction. And I believe that probably by the end of this century, we're going to see pretty much the total defeat for settler colonial and or colonial ideologies around the globe.
Well, I hope it's a lot sooner than that, but we'll see. I'll point out one thing, and that is that the Israelis the Zionists who run Palestine, in other words, have been sending trainers to Ukraine for years now, training Ukraine's police and military forces. So there's a lot to what you say there. And a defeat will definitely be a defeat for Zionism as well as for colonialism. Next on the list, Gonzalo Lira. There is no army in the West that will save the day. And he's referring to Ukraine here. There's no Western army in Ukraine that will save the day. You'll recall just about 2 months ago, Gonzalo Lira was held captive by the Nazis in Ukraine. And it took a lot of effort on the part of people around the world to get him released from that. Gonzalo Lira's latest video describes various failed initiatives by Ukraine's Nazi-led forces against Russia and Russia's successful counter-initiatives against Ukraine's forces. It's well worth watching, so check it out at the link under this video. We'll provide a link under this video that will take you to the entire video. So this is just an urging on my part to all the listeners to visit our site, visit our page on YouTube, and click on that video that has the Gonzalo Lira video.
It sounds like his argument is that despite the U.S. empire's best efforts, the Ukrainians are going to lose because no matter how many weapons they have, no matter how much the Israelis, infamously powerful military, are going to help them, they're not going to be able to overcome what Russia seems to have in place, which is a meticulously planned out model for fighting fascists. There was an article from a few months ago by Newsweek called "Putin Has Never Lost a War. Here's how he's going to win in Ukraine." And it looks like the modern Russian military is proving itself to be a force to be reckoned with.
Yes, and that's very similar to what Gonzalo Lira said. So good on you for not having watched the video, but you get the gist of what he said in that video. That's what he said. Basically, Russia's winning, Ukraine is losing, and the war is close to being finished. Next on the list, Michael Hudson on RT's CrossTalk Show, World Under Sanctions. Okay, this is another video that I want to urge people to watch. On the RT show CrossTalk, Michael Hudson, America's premier Marxist economist, talked about the boomerang effect of U.S. sanctions of the U.S. sanctions on Russia, China, Iran, and other countries that refuse to kowtow to U.S. hegemony. Europe, for example, due to extensive meddling of the U.S. empire in their elections there, now has leaders who are not looking after the interests of Russia, but rather only the interests of the American empire's leadership and rulers, the capitalist class. That is, sanctions on Russia are hurting Europe far more than they're hurting Russia, according to Hudson. You can see the entire show with the link we provide under this video.
So it does sound like what Washington is losing from this endless war it's trying to perpetuate is far, far outstepping what it's hoping to gain. As in, the irony again is so palpable, because Biden's White House wants to weaken Russia through means of systematically wearing down its resources, yet Washington is weakening its own resources. And social stability, again, is a big part of this irony, because Washington's big hope is that the economic blowback from Putin's decision to intervene will turn the people against him and create a color revolution. But it looks like Washington is bringing a revolution a lot closer towards itself by
right.
bringing its own people to the breaking point economically.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Next on the list and last, mass shootings are a symptom of the declining U.S. empire's fascist reaction.
Historically, when empires collapse, there are great explosions of violence. Throughout the Weimar Germany years, there were numerous not neo-Nazi, the old OG Nazi terrorist attacks.
Yeah.
And what's, I think, extremely ominous is that the state seemed to consistently enable those terrorist attacks. The left-wing violence in Germany at that time was punished so far disproportionately to the right-wing violence. And this really reminds me of Kyle Rittenhouse and that precedent that was set last year for right-wing vigilantes to kill people and get away with it just by claiming to have felt threatened. They're so willing to give the fascist terrorists the benefit of the doubt, and they're so willing to do the opposite for left-wing and or communist people who are just doing their jobs as organizers. And what that really is ominous for is the recent uptick of mass shootings, because some of these shootings have been political. There was a white nationalist mass shooter a couple of weeks ago who was killing black people to try to prevent what he thought was the Great Replacement, white genocide, something like that. And at a certain point, I feel that's going to get normalized as something that the state enables. I feel like this is part of a preparation for a paramilitary attack campaign against the people that the government doesn't like. I mean, how many times throughout history have we seen reactionary fascist states enable vigilantes to kill off people who the state views as revolutionary and or potential to be revolutionary? We saw hundreds of thousands of people die in Indonesia, largely at the hands of ordinary citizens who were whipped up into a paranoid frenzy by governmental rhetoric.
Yes. Well put. And I would only point out that your description of the Weimar Republic during the great amount of time, the early time of the Weimar Republic, the Social Democrats were in charge in much of Germany. So the Social Democrats were the ones who were encouraging the right wing in this way against the left wing and against the revolutionists. And that's part of the problem when you get reformist socialists. Reformist socialists have never brought socialism, and that's part of the reason why, because they, at heart, they're really liberals. So anyway, that's the end of our show for tonight. I want to thank you, Rainer, for everything you've done to make this show possible and as good as it is. And I want to thank all of the viewers for tuning in, and invite you to tune in again next week. So until next week, I bid you a sweet adieu.